Welcome everyone to today's Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a framework that absolutely blew my mind. It's a fascinating metaphysical concept that boldly bridges hard physical science with deep spiritual philosophy. If you've ever wondered how the invisible forces of the universe might be interacting with your everyday life, you are in the exact right place. We're going to explore the physics of the soul. Look around the room for a second. What do you see? Or actually, a better question, what don't you see? Could that invisible, empty space around you actually be dictating your destiny? We're so used to thinking of space as just nothingness, right? Like a blank canvas where things happen. But today's text asks us to completely throw that notion out the window. It asks us to view space not as an empty void, but as an active, molding force that dictates everything from our physical health to our ultimate fate. All right, let's get right into section 1, the meaning of space. To really grasp how this works, we've got to start at the foundation. The source defines space as the locations where matters and antimatters exist, and their movement scope. What's so fascinating here is the dependency. Space doesn't just exist on its own, it's entirely decided by material and non-material existence. The text makes a really firm rule about this. Without material, there is literally no space. Without non-material or antimatter, there is no negative space. That empty air between you and your screen right now isn't just a gap, it's a defined scope of existence. And we aren't just talking about one monolithic type of space here. The author splits it into two distinct categories. First, you've got absolute space. This is that theoretical, infinite canvas that can expand unlimitedly. But then you have relative space, which is a whole lot more tangible for us. This is simply the distance between an object and its surrounding objects. And this relative space is everywhere, all the time. There's relative space between massive swirling galaxies, and there's relative space between the tiny microscopic atoms that make up your own body. Moving on to section 2, positive and negative dimensions. Now that we know what space is made of, the text takes a really fascinating turn into duality. We aren't just living in a single dimension. On one side, we have positive space. This is where our physical human bodies exist. It's tied to mass and energy, and it's relatively stable. It twists and swells, sure, but it does so predictably. But on the flip side is negative space. This is the realm of non-materials and the spiritual body. And unlike the stable physical world, negative space is an environment of limitless, sudden, and abrupt changes. It's basically a wildly unpredictable spiritual counterpart to our stable physical reality. Which brings us to section 3, how space shapes us. So how does all this intense cosmological theory actually impact our day-to-day lives? Well, the crucial takeaway here is that space literally changes the forms and movement laws of objects. The source argues that different spatial environments radically mold who we are. For example, people living in frigid zones have distinctly different physical figures compared to those in tropical environments. Same goes for the space of a dense urban city versus a wide-open rural landscape. It actually changes human appearances. And it goes way beyond just the physical. The distinct space of a fast-paced commercial market versus a quiet church or temple creates entirely different mentalities, behaviors, and ways of thinking between businessmen and priests. The space you inhabit is literally shaping your body and your mind. And this translates into real-world action. The text suggests that just shifting your space can trigger almost miraculous changes. Got a disease contracted in a cold, moist region? The source says it can cure itself automatically just by moving your physical body to a warm, dry zone. Ailments born in the city can completely vanish in the countryside. But it's not just about health. It applies to our professional lives, too. An average, unrecognized worker might suddenly achieve massive success simply by transferring to a new environment. Or a low-ranking official who feels totally stuck might absolutely thrive and make a fortune if they just move into the space of the business world. The potential inside the person didn't change at all. The spatial environment acting upon them did. Which leads us to this incredibly bold quote straight from the source. If one wants to change his life, he has to change the activity space. The text does not mince words here. If you want a different outcome in life, you cannot stay in the exact same spatial configuration. If you do, the author warns that days and months will just pass you by and you'll simply stagnate until the very end without making any real progress. Space is the ultimate catalyst for change. So I want you to really think about this for a second. Are you stuck in the same space right now? Think about your daily routine, your office, your city, the social circles you hang out in. If you feel like your life isn't progressing, the source text would argue that it's not necessarily a lack of willpower on your part. It's a literal physics problem. Your current activity space is holding you in a stagnant pattern. Let's dive into section 4, energy and spatial distortion. This brings us to what I consider the absolute climax of this whole framework. It's where physics and spirituality truly collide. Let's unpack this beautifully complex concept. The text argues that space can actually be expanded, compressed, or twisted based on mass or energy. In negative space, this creates a really bizarre asymmetry. For a high-energy figure, the distance between them and smaller objects is expanded. But for the low-energy follower who is looking back at that figure, the space is compressed. That means two different entities in the exact same relationship are experiencing two completely different realities of distance. Wild, right? To really ground this, the source impartially uses major world religions to map out exactly how this spatial asymmetry works. Let's trace this across the faiths mentioned: Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Taoism. Because the believer is the low-energy entity in this dynamic, their space is compressed. So from the believer's perspective, the deity, whether that's Yahweh, Jesus, Allah, Buddha, or Lao Tzu, feels right beside them, intimately guiding their words and actions. But from the perspective of the high-energy deity, the space expands. To them, the believers exist at a great distance, and non-believers are incredibly far away. The text uses this impartially just to explain the underlying mechanics of spiritual gravity. And that leads us perfectly into Section 5, the paradox of high energy. So what does the spatial distortion mean for everyday folks like you and me? The author uses this beautiful, poetic line: "A bosom friend afar brings a distant land near." According to the framework, this is exactly what happens to low-energy people. The physical distance of thousands of miles gets compressed by their connection, making it feel as though that distant friend is just sitting right behind a wall. The space literally shrinks to accommodate their bond. But here is the catch. What happens if you are the one accumulating all this mass? What if, through success or spiritual growth or immense mental fortitude, you actually become the high-energy figure in your own life? Well, here is the stark, kind of melancholic conclusion the source leaves us with. Because high energy literally expands the negative space between you and everyone else, you experience this profound physical and spiritual isolation. The higher your energy climbs, the further away everyone else feels. Even if someone is standing right in front of you, it'll feel like they're at the other end of the world. The text notes that this is exactly why people with the highest energy often feel the loneliest. Even if you're surrounded by a loud, chaotic market, this spatial distortion leaves you feeling distant, mournful, and totally alone. It is an incredibly profound paradox to wrap up on. If growing your energy, becoming greater, stronger, more spiritually massive, inherently pushes the rest of the world further away, we're left with a really vital question. If your energy level isolates you, how will you bridge the space between yourself and the world? I want to leave you to contemplate your own energy, the connections in your life, and the literal space you take up in this universe. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the space around you.